Thank you, praise team. I just feel led to remind us just how much preparation and service goes in just to provide a setting for us to really engage God. The praise team comes in early, and they not only do all the logistics, but we pray. They pray for you as well. I just want to really encourage you to come at a time when we can really jumpstart together, really get into His presence together. But as we shift now to a time in the Word, I wanted to start with reflection on my own life. That I have 3 ladies in my life. I have my wife, my spouse, plus 2 girls. And anybody who knows what it's like to live in a home with 3 very individual and dramatic persons, it can get kind of crazy. Life is crazy, but then when there's, sometimes I realize I'm a very even-keeled person. I don't have a lot of ups and downs. This is the way God has been making me and shaping me. But there are times when I realize that it's things and the really important things that happen sometimes in our family. It doesn't happen when we're all together in a family dinner or the normal daily stuff. A lot of times it happens when there's a one-on-one. And in fact, I realized this because I've been away a lot because of trips and so on and so forth, much more than I was last year. And my family, I can see that having an effect on them, where my daughters are asking now for special time. Okay, you know what that means? Okay, that means they just want one-on-one time with me. And sometimes life is so busy I don't realize how important it is. And I try to sell the idea, okay, let's have special time with Dad. This is how I sell it, like most fathers do. Let's go get some ice cream. 16 handles, right? And I thought to myself, maybe that's the only reason why they want special time with Dad, just to talk. And honestly, even in our discussions, there's not much great depth. I asked them, how's school going? No. Most of it is just kind of like, you don't really, but there's something there. It's an open door where even in our special times, sometimes I can touch and talk about places in their lives that they wouldn't be the freedom to. I can go into depths to talk with them, that they would know me and I would know them. I'm going to continue on in this, and I need to do a better job. But I not only just plan to have dates with my wife, but dates with my daughters, and kind of follow through on this special time from a father's heart. What I was realizing is that more than sometimes I'm really able and wanting to be there, my daughters are there. But I was reflecting on this, that God Himself, like a father, is longing to have that kind of exclusive time with us, where He can really echo back to us His encouragements, His heart, what He sees, His corrections, His strengthening. And that many times we don't realize it, but we really need this connection with God that's just exclusive of everything else that's going on. The word that the Christian tradition and the church recognizes as a practice, as a really a lifestyle that describes is called solitude. Being alone with God. And it's so central. I'm going to try to really express just in my heart how important this is. In the same way, some things don't get addressed. There's not a depth in relationship that happens sometimes unless there is this set aside time. This exclusivity to be able to really face-to-face engage. There's something of that in our relationship with God. That when there is not this kind of connection with God in solitude, there is a huge superficiality that does not change. You don't grow in the depths without solitude. And I'm going to kind of share that today as we talk through. And the message title is called Alone with God, the Crucible of Solitude. And I want to read from a passage in Matthew chapter 14:23, that this was Jesus' pattern. That He did this not just once. This is one passage where you see this. But right when things are moving, when life is crazy, when He's on the move, but in all kinds of other circumstances, He stops and intentionally steps and withdraws to have His time with God in solitude. And it establishes a model and a pattern for us, but also it encourages us to enter into that very same dynamic with God. Matthew chapter 14, verse 23 reads, after He had dismissed them, He went up on the mountainside by Himself to pray. When evening came, He was there alone. Now, if you ever think about somebody, maybe you've seen them before, off in a corner by themselves. In our social environment, that's actually kind of either a taboo or like, oh, that poor person. I need to go and I can encourage them. We don't have this sense of healthy aloneness, okay? So how many of you feel comfortable going to a movie by yourself? Raise your hand. Yes, some of us do. A lot of us feel like, ooh, I would feel like such a loser if I had, bought a ticket by myself. Many of us don't have this comfort, just not even alone with God, but just being alone. There's a whole history. Some people's relational history is like this. They've never had even a couple of weeks without a boyfriend or a girlfriend because they need that for some reason. There's not the security and self-awareness and this sense of anchoredness of being alone. That's just normal. On top of that, being alone with God. Our culture makes it even harder. So when we see passages like this, it either sounds either too super spiritual or kind of strange. I mean, what punishment do we give children and prisoners when they've done something bad? Right? Solitary confinement. We don't have this sense that being alone, much less alone with God, is healthy and good. These days, we're even further cursed. Okay? Social media is an incredible boon. It does so good, much good, but it also just chips away at the very human reality of needing to be alone and alone with God, where we have access to other people's lives and other people's communication, and even if they're not there in the room, their presence there, their voice is there with us always. Our hearts and our minds are crowded all the time. If that wasn't bad enough, now we have phones, right, where you can talk to them if you feel lonely. Hi Siri, how are you doing? When you need help, when you need encouragement. It's kind of sad that we don't have this vigorous pattern of saying, not only can I be alone and experience that and grow in that, but I can be alone with God. But Jesus did not have this problem. In fact, you see that Jesus was always surrounded by the throngs of people, but out of sheer, I think, both instinct and out of intentionality, he pulled himself out. Not just this time. Here is just a slide with a bunch of places in the scriptures where you see Jesus doing this. This is a definite pattern, okay? So at the beginning of his ministry, he spends 40 days in the desert, prompted by God, alone, okay? Fighting the enemy to basically make the Lord's voice primary in his life. Before he begins to make one of the biggest decisions of his life, which is which disciples to choose. The book of Luke tells us that he spends all night praying alone, okay, with God. You find that, and this is what I love about the Bible, it reveals just how much of Jesus is not only the super divine being, but he's a human. He lived out full humanity. When hearing that his cousin, John the Baptist, was horribly murdered, grappling with his grief, what does he do? He withdraws to be with God alone. Jesus, when he does this incredible miracle, he feeds not only the 5,000, but the numbers are that that's just the men, the families, and so on and so forth. The women and the children are there. He does this miracle in the wilderness, which people basically is a sign that he is the coming Messiah, the one that God is sending. They get so excited, and in the throng of popularity, they say, "Be our king, be our king." And they try to shove him into a role he doesn't want to follow. What does he do? He stops and he withdraws to anchor his heart and his mission before God. After a long night of work, okay, I thought about this one. He's so tired. He is exhausted. How does he decompress? He runs into the Father's arms to be alone with him in solitude. After healing of a leper, and finally, before he goes to the cross, yes, his disciples in outer rings are there. His 3 closest are a stone's throw away. And then his others are even further. But all the action is happening when he is alone with God. This is not only the pattern that he lives, but it also encourages us and reminds us and calls us to. There's an invitation. So in the setting that he is growing up in, they all pray together all the time. But he says, on top of that, go pray and be found praying in your closet. It's a radical thing for that time and for us even. His disciples are coming back from an incredibly, wonderful trip where they went proclaiming the gospel, and they saw demons leave in Jesus' name. They saw healings. They saw incredible movement of God. The kingdom of God is here, and they were used so powerfully. And they're coming back. They're so excited. And what does Jesus say? Come with me to a lonely place. Let's debrief. Let's be alone with God. There is this importance repeatedly of finding and isolating and withdrawing and being to be alone with God that we see in Jesus' life and also his call. So I want to talk a little about what solitude is and what it's supposed to do in our lives, as well as I always try to do, I try to give us some encouragements of these are some of the ways that we can jump in it. It has to be practiced. It's not enough to know this, but it has to be engaged and practiced. So here is, a slide and a quote that helps us to kind of realize the people who know what they're talking about in terms of walking with God, having a deep spiritual life, they all remind us, as Jesus does, we have to find time like this. We have to know how to have this time of solitude with God. This is Henri Nouwen, and he's gone, he's passed on, but he's left us an incredible witness of the depths of spiritual life. And this is what he says, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. Without solitude, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. I want to let that sink in, okay? Without solitude, and I'll define that for you in a second, it is virtually impossible to live a spiritual life, okay? So you can have all kinds of stuff, great preachers, you can have great praise teams, you can have all kinds of devotions coming into your inbox, you can have all kinds of things, spiritual technology, but it'll all be just on the outside. It will never really begin to go into the depths and meet you in the depths. It's kind of like a 14 karat gold ring versus a 24 karat, right? 14 karat, it might be electroplated on the outside, but you scratch it and you see it doesn't go very deep. That's what ends up happening. All this spiritual wealth, but it never penetrates, it never transforms. You cannot live a spiritual life without this. So what is solitude? This is my definition. I'm calling it an intentional withdrawal. You're choosing to, okay? Sometimes you find yourself alone by accident, but most of the time, you're still not alone with God. So it's an intentional withdrawal from every other presence and voice to be vibrantly alone with God. You are choosing to withdraw from other presences, other people, okay? And our cell phones and our tablets and so on and so forth, they represent other voices, okay? So you can be alone and surfing the internet. That's not being alone with God. It's intentional withdrawal from every other presence and voice in order to be not just alone, but vibrantly alone. Then imagine that the one person that you really want to talk to, you have exclusive access. They're not going to pick up their phone. They're not going to be thinking about something else. Every fiber of their being is on you, and you get to have that kind of exclusive time. That's what we get in solitude with God. One description of this is coming from the 19th century, and this is the guy named Walter Savage Landor, and he was a 19th century writer and poet. And he put it like this: solitude is the audience chamber of God. And I have to give you a little background. Why would he say audience chamber? And when we think of audience chamber, we think of what? Like a big stadium, where a Broadway play is going on. What he means is an audience chamber is this. Back then, kings, they would have public court, but they would have a private court where they would sit and they would have one-on-one. You would have the full attention of the king to be invited into a small room where he would be sitting and you would have exclusive access. Solitude is like, and that's actually a picture of that, a king's audience chamber in Windsor Castle back in the 19th century. You get to come in to the very place where there's nothing that's going to come to take his attention away or yours, and you can talk with him face to face, the very king of the universe. That's what he's talking about. Solitude is the audience chamber of God. Well, sometimes solitude has such a ugly ring especially if we've tried it before and we don't know how to do it. And sometimes it feels like solitude is what? Being by yourself feels like loneliness, where you don't have somebody to talk to. You feel, an ache because someone's not there, okay? Like an empty house, or sometimes people, we feel that. Loneliness. Well, one way to think of this is loneliness is actually that. It's a sense of inner emptiness. You're not connected. There's nothing there. There's not a sense of satisfaction. There's not a sense of connection. But solitude with God is inner fulfillment. It's describing that when we spend time with God, just Him and us, excluding every other presence and voice, to be vibrantly alone with God, just like Jesus does over and over again, something happens. The ache in our hearts that cannot be satisfied by going on Facebook, that cannot be satisfied by being in a crowd, or even being sometimes with good friends. The real hunger of our hearts gets satisfied, and then we get to experience a deep inner fulfillment. And the fulfillment works this way. It's a twofold. This is Richard Foster again. Solitude does this in our lives, in our persons. It doesn't just give us time where we can talk to God and be with God, but there is a result. There is a fruit from this fulfillment. And that one is, it works this way. Number one, when we have time with God, just carving out and exclusively, whether we're in prayer or talking with Him, listening in silence, engaging in His Word, but we're doing this, we're having this exclusivity, it's like something's happening in our persons. And he uses the metaphor of a spiritual tank. Okay? That our very spiritual tanks are being enlarged. Okay? In other words, like if you imagine a car that doesn't get really good gas mileage but has a really small tank of gas, right? So your range is not very far because you're getting really bad gas mileage and your tank is small. But can you imagine swapping out that tank for a larger tank? That's actually what he's saying. Something is happening when we are spending time with God, that God Himself is excavating, digging out the depths of our person. You can say taking out junk, but He's making us deeper with Him. Where we spend time with Him, and our capacity to know Him, our capacity to echo Him, to be like Him, to reflect His character, begins to shift and change. Our tanks are enlarged. But it's not just enlarged. Okay, by the way, let me do this, I forgot. Every person who's actually spent time doing any kind of Christian history or looking in the scriptures realizes that, this is John Ortberg, that any person of great spiritual, development, somebody who's become somebody of strength and worth, really reflecting God, it didn't happen not only overnight, but it didn't happen outside of actually solitude. Okay? Every character of great spiritual development in Scripture is marked by solitude. That's what solitude does. It begins to deepen you, begins to excavate you, where things and patterns and stuff that you normally do, and you don't even realize, just by default, God is able to speak and be able to break and be able to move in our hearts. He's able to shift our very thinking and our very living and our very personhood as He excavates, cuts away. But He doesn't just do that part, He also does a second part. Not only does He excavate, give us greater capacity, right? He actually even fills us. This is the time of both excavation and filling. Kind of like a fuel tank, putting in gas for the next leg of our journey. Here's the problem. Many of us who do not spend time in solitude, our cups, our tanks are very small. And when we meet God, let's say we come to a revival, we come to like a great place where His presence is moving, guess what? We get filled and like, oh, this is so great. But because our cup, our tanks are so small, it doesn't last very long. Okay? So you walk out the door and somebody actually looks at you funny and you feel all jealous. And that begins to take control. Somebody says something and you get bitter. Okay? Instead of having the tank to be able to overwhelm them in the mercy and the grace of Christ. Okay? Our tanks are so small. We can only give them 10 milliliters of Christ's love, of Christ's character. And then we need a filling again, but it's that small because there hasn't been an excavation to know who Christ is and have Him shaped and formed in us. So the question is, How big is your cup? How big is your cup? When somebody comes across you, and you've had a really bad day, all kinds of things are happening, and your tank is so depleted, and they say something, or they look like they're going to cut you off, and what happens? Okay? Or is God working in such a way in your heart that He's digging you deeper in greater grace, in greater love, in greater Christ-likeness, greater insight, where you're not scatterbrained, but actually you have a perseverance. How many milliliters of perseverance do you have? I find that one of the most powerful ways in my own life, because honestly, I don't have a lot of perseverance. God keeps drawing me into a place of solitude and keeps digging me in understanding and in His presence. And after I come out, what used to just kick my butt, I'm able to stand. What used to be able to just really, unravel me, I'm able to, in fact, instead, overflow with grace because there's depth that He's building in. This is what I'm afraid of, that if all we know is just the spontaneous filling every now and then, and there's not this excavating, we will not have the spiritual fuel for the next leg of the journey. We will not be able to grow and grow deeper. But the very promise is, once we develop this, once we have this engagement with God, just like Jesus did, even the tough things, even the stuff that would kick our butt spiritually, we'll be given the strength, the grace, and the perseverance to be as Christ in that very circumstance. To be a mother who's able to love your children when they're gone crazy. To be a father, to be able to give wisdom when you feel sapped and dry. To be gracious even to strangers when you feel like you're at your bottom limit. This is what it means, that when we feel strapped, guess what? That's a good sense that God wants to actually dig us, to give us greater capacity, even in the context of solitude. So here's a few practical suggestions as we round out the sermon, just to encourage you. We need to put this into practice. And I remember preaching sermons before, apply or die, right? Apply or die. And here's one. This doesn't happen by accident. Okay? So if you find yourself alone, if you don't intentionally pursue God, what are you going to do? You're going to play a video game, or you're going to do something else. You're going to go on Facebook. We have to, trust me, I've done this. Okay? If you've got a lot of time, you look at the back and you find out, oh my gosh, I didn't spend any time with God, because everything is pulling us the other way. But the second we actually really say, God, I really want to have time with you, okay, the Spirit begins to pull us and enable us to do this. Pull out to have intentional solitude, okay? I know this is not easy, but let's be encouraged that there are incredible creative ways to do this. I ran across a little story from Charles and John Wesley's mother. She was an incredibly spiritual woman. She had lots of kids. Okay, we have 2 kids, and we don't know how to juggle them. Generations past had like 10 kids. Okay, you think we're busy? Can you imagine 10 kids? In a life like that, how do you begin to have solitude with God? And she struggled with that. She had a depth that, in fact, her sons tapped. When I was doing Christian history, John Wesley, half his sermons, or more than half his material, came from the books of his mom's library. Did you know that? He just dug into his mom's life because she was a deep person in prayer and in mentoring. And how did she have time to develop this? You know what she would do? All her kids are going crazy in front of her, and she would say, Mommy's having alone time with God, and she would take her apron, put it over her head. And that sounds really stupid, doesn't it? And she would do her alone time with God. Kids are all around, okay? But the kids learned to stop bothering her because her apron was over her head, right? We have to find times to isolate, okay? And going to the bathroom and closing the door doesn't count. We need to find some time to just isolate, and it's doable. I know this one guy, and he's an amazing Bible teacher. He's at a church that I was with before. He would teach young adults, and all kinds of wisdom would come out from him. They would be like, he's a normal guy. He works at a department store. He was a manager at a department store, and I actually went to his memorial service, and people at work were talking about how incredible a person he was, non-Christians. And as they were sharing this, they were talking about, yeah, but he was a little funny. There were times when he wanted to be alone because he would have these earplugs on. And one day I came by and asked him what he's listening to, and he said, not really nothing. And he took off his earphones. He was listening to nothing. He had nothing on his earphones, his noise-canceling earphones. Nobody bothered him because he had his earphones on, but he was having alone time with God. There's ways, if we choose to isolate and carve out time. Second, it's a good thing to start with silence. Before we just rush in, God knows our needs, but just to calm our hearts, look to listen for Him, center. And this is more than simply just a physical thing. There's a spiritual thing where we can sense His presence as we calm our hearts, as we kind of submit in silence. Next, I really do encourage us, get into the practice of journaling. Okay? Journaling means just writing down stuff. There's a lot of ways to journal, but you don't have to make it, 3 pages every day. But I really encourage you, find a place to collect the things that God shares with you and reveals to you, and what you experience, even in the context of solitude. And lastly, if you have a hard time doing this, you wouldn't know what to do with 15 minutes by yourself, 20 minutes by yourself. Start off with a group. And this sounds really stupid, doesn't it? Group solitude. How do you have group solitude? That's like oxymoron, right? Right? Group solitude. This is what group solitude is. If you know you wouldn't sit still for 15 minutes and be able to kind of dig in deep with God, grab 3 or 4 people who agree with you and go on a certain, adventure where go to a very quiet place and everybody come together and we talk and fellowship, and then get there and decide we're going to have solitude for the next 30 minutes or 45 minutes, and you split up. Okay? Take your journals with you, spend time, really go face to face with God, and then you come back and you can share, you can talk. But what you wouldn't have done by yourself, you can do with a group. But you had solitude. You've actually pushed out and intentionally had vibrant time with God. I want you to bow your heads with me now. And I want to start the response time with reminding you of this. What drove Jesus to withdraw into lonely places where He could be found alone with God? Yes, there was need. Yes, in His human experience, there was grief, there was frustration, there was suffering. But I think the deepest reason why He ran into those times alone with God, because He knew His Father wanted to have special time with Him. He knew His Father had something to share. He knew His Father was going to fill Him and meet Him and strengthen Him there. Do you know your Father wants to have special time with you? If you don't have a relationship with Christ like this, guess what? This is for every single child of God. When you know Jesus, you step into this very inheritance where though Father has many children, He wants you to come exclusively into His audience chamber. I know there are a lot of excuses. I know there are a lot of reasons, even justifiable ones, why this is really hard. But would you begin to intentionally say, God, I want to have time with you. I'm going to integrate, yes, my time in the Word, yes, my time in prayer. I'm going to do something about this, even this week. I encourage you, make it concrete. How will you, when, where, carve out time to withdraw, to make it time vibrant with God? And I want to encourage you, as you do, God will meet you there. God will begin to enlarge in your tank. He will fill you. The places where you just run dry, He will grant perspective, perseverance. Will you begin to meet Him there? Spend some time in reflection and prayer. I'll close this. Hi, this is Pastor Martin from New Vision Community Church. Thanks for taking the time to watch the video. I'd love to have a chance to meet you, as well as I want to invite you to come to worship with us on a Sunday. For more information, go to www.newvisioncommunity.net.